Greetings. My name is Scott Kinney with Discovery Education. I'm the Senior Vice President, and I have the opportunity to work with school systems all over the world as they make this transition from a print environment to a digitally enhanced environment. And it is my honor to speak with you today around the topic of digital content and your incredible role in that transition. Over the years, I've spoken a bit about this topic, and oftentimes I begin with a simple question. I ask folks I chat with, whether they're teachers or administrators or superintendents, to answer this question. And the question simply, as you walk around your school system and you look at the way that instructional content's delivered, how would you primarily categorize that? Now, understanding it's never just one way, but if you had to pick one of these, whether it was text or lecture or media or hands-on, which one of these would you choose? And so I'm not going to ask you to actually text in your answer today, given that we're on some time constraints. But if you would just think about it, maybe even do a show of hands on how many people think primarily it's text versus lecture versus media versus hands-on. And we'll come back to this question in just a bit. So one of the things that's happening right now is that a lot of folks are talking about digital. Sometimes you hear President Obama refer to that in the next 5 years, school systems will move to digital textbooks. Certainly, the Secretary of Education, Arne Duncan, is saying similar things. It is bipartisan, certainly. So, former Secretary of Education Margaret Spellings, under the Bush administration, is head of something called the LEAD Commission, so Leading Education by Advancing Digital. And it's not just the U.S. You see places like Australia, you see places like Korea, who have digital initiatives as well.
컴퓨터와 인터넷 시대, 앞으로는 교실 풍경도 엄청나게 달라질 텐데.
Malaysia is another school system or another educational system that is looking to move digital in their instructional materials as well. And so the question then really becomes, why? Why all this conversation around moving to a digital learning environment? And so if you put the student at the center of this, oftentimes I kind of think of this in three different buckets. So the first bucket is we know that today's students interact with content differently than any previous generation of learners. The Kaiser Family Foundation does a great study every 4 years, and they look at the amount of time kids 8 to 18 spend with media. And one of the things that we see is that's around 7.5 hours a day. And what's really interesting about this study is this doesn't include time spent in schools, incidentally. And so if you do the math, it's actually over 40 hours a week. So it's more than a full-time job that our students today spend consuming information through media. Even more than that, they're actually exposed to greater amounts of media than just the time they spend with it. So you might ask, well, how is that possible? Well, that's possible because oftentimes, like I know my own kids, I'll walk into a bedroom and they're on their iPhone and they have earbuds in their ears and they're watching television or they're multitasking. So they actually consume about 10 hours worth of information every day through media. So Joe, on the right-hand side here, gives us a snapshot of what today's students are thinking.
Joe, what are you doing there?
I don't know.
What's going on?
Well, this is this is like a foreign tool.
Okay. What was it? You said you were having a problem earlier?
Oh, yeah. Wait, where's it? Yeah. So, I want to read more about Frederick Douglass, or maybe see a larger image. So I double-clicked on the picture, but nothing's happening.
Oh.
And then I can't really read the text because it's kind of small. So looking for the system preferences so I can make the text bigger, but can't find anything.
Laura, you said there was a problem involved?
You can't double-click the image because
So you certainly get the idea. And this starts at a very young age. If you look across the world, nearly, about 20% of kids, 2 to 5, can actually use a smartphone application. But less than 1 in 10 of those same kids can actually tie their own shoes. So we see a generation of students that clearly is migrating towards a digital world. The second thing to take a look at is their ability to access information that's really current and relevant to them. And so if you think about a traditional textbook, one of the things that might not be represented is something like this.
In 2006, astronomy was shaken to its very core. After almost 80 years, Pluto lost its status as the ninth planet. The International Astronomical Union couldn't ignore findings that similar, even larger bodies than Pluto traverse the outer solar system. Forced to define the word for the first time, astronomers established three distinct criteria to determine the native planet. First, the object must orbit the sun. Second, it must have sufficient gravity to maintain a planet's spherical shape. Finally, after millions of...
So if you really want to have some fun, think about all the things that are in a traditional textbook that might be misrepresented or may not be accurate. So Pluto, certainly not being a planet, is one of those things. But what are some other things that after 4, 5, 6 years, those textbooks that you're currently using might not represent accurately? If you want to have some fun, go ahead and pause this presentation, and you can have some discussion in small groups. But the other thing, as you see on your screen, that oftentimes we forget about is it's not just the content that changes, but oftentimes it's also the standards. So by show of quick hands, how many people in this room have gone through in their educational career or their teaching career, how many have gone through a standards adoption change? Whether that's Common Core or even if you're not a Common Core state, let's say you're in Texas or Virginia, I'm sure you've seen standards that have changed over time. And so one of the nice things about digital content is not only that ability to change the content itself, but to change those alignments or change that structure so that it really meets the needs of new content adoptions or new standards adoptions. Finally, and probably most importantly, I believe that one of the things that we have to look at and focus on is that we have students in our classroom that all learn differently. They all learn at different paces, and they all have different learning styles. And so how do we deliver instructional materials in a way that meets their needs? This is a simple study. It's a bit old, to be honest with you. It was done in 2003, but I think it really kind of captures the essence of what we're talking about here, which is there were two groups working with young students in a developing country. So not a whole lot of technology at hand, took some of those things out of the equation. And basically they broke the two groups into two different randomly assigned areas. One that had learning materials using text only, and one that used a variety of learning materials. So text, images, animations, sound, and then they assessed those students on the impact of their learning. Now, just having known nothing else about this study, but having been in an educational professional for some time, which one would you think would learn better? If I deliver to my students learning materials only using text, or if I also deliver text, but also enhance that with images, animation, sound, which group is going to do better when we assess them for their knowledge and understanding? And clearly, the answer is the second. Because the point of this is we know that students learn differently. We know we can reach different students in our classrooms using different types of materials. If you remember back to that initial question that I asked you, I said, when you see instructional materials in your school delivered, how are they primarily delivered? Well, this is what, over the last few years, when I've asked these questions, people have told me. They say, typically it's 70% lecture, some text, a little hands-on, and the very least, a tiny bit of media. I also typically, during these presentations, when I have a little bit more time, ask this question: which best describes you as a learner? So if you had to put yourself primarily in one of these buckets, which one would you choose? And this is what people have told me over the last few years. They say primarily, a few of us are auditory, some read write, some kinesthetic, but most of us are really visual learners. And if you take a look at these side by side, you see a big problem. The problem is, if we were to reinvent schools for the first time and try to marry the way we deliver content versus the way we choose to learn, we really couldn't get it much worse than we do. Now, the idea isn't how do we then individualize instruction for every student. It's how do we become smarter and use the technology and tools that we're afforded in order to reach the needs of every student. So if you look at this static image, you see a life cycle, if you will. This is great for our visual learners, people that want to have that organizational structure. But you'll notice now that we've also engaged students in a tactile way. We have text to the left side. And when we click on this button, we can also have this text read to us. So with a really low-tech solution, we now have the ability and the power to reach the needs of all of our students, regardless of how they learn, whether they're read-write or kinesthetic, choose to hear audio. And the question then, does this make a difference? And so one of the things that we do is we work with schools on an ongoing basis, and we look at schools like Charlotte-Mecklenburg, who we've worked with for about 5 years now, and we've seen incredible results as they've implemented digital content. But don't take it from me. Here's a quick snippet of one of their administrators talking about the impact.
Specifically in this learning community, we saw our student gains over 25% in 1 year, which was just remarkable growth. My goal for this learning community was double-digit growth, which is 10%. Let's see if we can attain 10% and bring our level of student achievement up. 3 to 5% is healthy growth, but we knew that we could do at least 10. But when we saw that we had accomplished more than 25%, that was amazing.
Certainly, we've seen a huge jump in our student achievement results, particularly in the area of science, but some growth as well in reading and math, particularly at our elementary schools.
And so you also see places like Mooresville-Graydon, a smaller school district also in North Carolina, that has used their digital conversion, so basically eliminating textbooks over the past 5 years. They've seen their academic scores rise, and at the same time, and this is one of the misnomers of digital, they've seen their per pupil expenditure also decline. And so while they're third in the state out of 115 schools academically, they're 99th out of 115 in per pupil expenditure. And so the question then becomes not why digital, but why not? Why aren't more and more people moving to a digital environment? Well, sometimes we think it's because we'd get a lot of resistance from our parent community. So this was a great research study out of the Learning in the 21st Century, who talked about what is the percentage of parents who do not think online textbooks are a good idea? And the shocking answer is actually 5%. Oftentimes, we think we know what our community is looking for, but we have a disconnect. Here are the percentage of parents willing to buy a mobile device if school systems use them for learning, 62%. Percentage of administrators unlikely to allow them to use mobile devices, just about as high. And so we've seen entire industries pop up, like this moving truck for cellular devices in New York City. When cell phones were banned, pop-up industry came up where students literally give their cell phone to this device. They put it in a little cubby hole, they get a ticket, it's $1 a day, and at the end of school they can then retrieve their electronic devices. The other big thing is we often think about this disconnect between students who have technology and who don't have technology. And the reality is, in the United States, most students have access to going online. In fact, it's a shocking 95%. So the question is, what about those 5%? What about those students who don't have access to getting online? Well, who are they? Let's take a look at that 5%. Generally speaking, they come from low household income families. And generally speaking, they come from a family where the parents have a less than a high school education level. In fact, it's the biggest determining factor. So I would ask you to take a look at this equity issue and look at it a little bit differently. If we know students have to have these skills to be successful in today's world, and in fact, one of the things that we know is about 80% of Fortune 500 companies require online application for jobs, places like Walmart and Target. And if you can't get online, typically you'll do it in a kiosk in the business itself. If we know that you have to have these skills in order to be successful, then how can we use an excuse of, but they don't have access at home, as a reason to not provide them these skills in school? I would argue that one of the things that we have to look in education and ask ourselves the question is, how do we make sure that that 5% has access to rich digital quality and has these skills? Because it will be the only way they're successful in an ever-changing world. So with that, I know I went pretty quickly, but it's been my pleasure speaking with you today about the power of digital content. And I'm incredibly excited about the role you're playing in your school systems as you continue to develop your strategy and to continue to develop learning environments that are great for kids. Thanks so much.